afternoon. My name is Paul Mueller. I'm Associate Professor of Economics at the King's College, and I am going to be summarizing one of the chapters from Larry White's The Clash of Economic Ideas today for students in my Economic Thought and Practice class. All right, this video is about Chapter 5, about the Great Depression and John Maynard Keynes' book, The General Theory of Economics. All right. So the setting for John Maynard Keynes' famous book that revolutionized economics is the Great Depression, which in the United States took place in the 1930s. Of course, in other parts of the world, Britain, especially where Keynes lived and worked, and in Germany as well, the Depression hit much earlier in the 20s. And just to remind you of what they saw happening at the time, this Depression, they saw massive amounts of unemployment, millions of people without work who want work. They see factories shutting down and being empty. They see slack resources in the economy. And as you can imagine, and you know from history, millions of people without work for long periods of time, not having ways to provide for their families, not seeing the market working, created a great deal of political unrest. Obviously in Germany, that led to the rise of the Nazis to power. But there was political unrest in Britain and in the US. And John Maynard Keynes enters the scene to try to explain what's going wrong with the economy and what politicians can do about it. Now, he was just one of several voices at the time explaining what made Great Depressions happen and why this came about. So some economists had argued that there was an overexuberance in the 1920s, particularly for the U.S. You have Murray Rothbard and others arguing that there was artificial stimulation of credit markets, that the federal government, particularly the Federal Reserve, had made credit too easily available, and that fueled a boom, a lot of investment that was unsustainable. And then the Great Depression was sort of the correction where people realized these investments were unsustainable. Another view, this is the most popular view actually, that came about in contrast to Keynes in the 1960s, was that of Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, who published a famous work, A Monetary History of the United States. And in that work, they argued that the Great Depression in the U.S. was particularly severe and particularly long because of problems with the Federal Reserve again, but of a different sort than Rothbard and some Austrian business cycle theorists argued. They argued that the Federal Reserve reduced the money supply too drastically. It didn't provide credit, and it didn't serve as a lender of last resort when it was supposed to, and that led to thousands of banks failing and shutting down and people losing their money, and the deflation that went on in the 1930s that made it particularly severe. So their story is a government monetary equilibrium problem, that you've got bad government policy, monetary policy causing the problems. There's also, in more recent scholarship, another dynamic that economists talk about in terms of why the Great Depression lasted so long was because of the policies that were enacted during the Great Depression. So for a time, people thought that President Roosevelt's New Deal, with huge amounts of spending and huge new public works programs, were an important part of fighting the Depression. More recent scholarship suggests that, in fact, those policies and the various regulations and administrative bureaus that he created most likely extended and deepened the Depression. That's why you actually have a recession within the Depression in the late 1930s. And so there's a policy component here as well, that in fact, U.S. policy, government policy during the Depression likely lengthened it and worsened it. But for the purpose of today, we're going to talk about Keynes' explanation, which was novel and became widely accepted by the late 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. Most economists are identifying with Keynesian theory in one way or another. And so what Keynes comes on the scene and argues is that, contrary to looking at the government for the problem, he argues that it's the free market system itself that is unstable, that you can have significant disequilibriums occur for long periods of time, and market forces are not necessarily going to act quickly to open up new jobs, to open up new factories. And you could get stuck in this low employment, low growth world with lots of unemployment. And if that's true, that it's the market system, free market system itself that's unstable, then you need something outside of the market system to correct it, to compensate or fix it. And that was government. right? The only thing big enough outside the market system was government to come in. And so Keynes's model is going to be a government model where government comes in to correct excesses and problems in the market, particularly with or by spending large amounts of money. As I've mentioned before in class, Keynes's view of the economy is driven entirely by spending. We talked about aggregate demand and the way in which the problem in recessions is there's not enough money, there's not enough spending to get people back to work. And so government needs to enter in to do that. This is where national income accounting, again, it wasn't invented by Keynes, but he utilized it heavily. He wasn't the first person to talk about macroeconomics or the macroeconomy, but again, he talked about it more than anyone before him had. And he, in particular, used lots of aggregates to talk about labor as a group or government spending as a group to describe what's going on. In his view of things, he talks about how saving is simply a loss. When people don't spend money, that is bad for the economy. This is known as the Paradox of Thrift, which we talked about in class. And so contrary to previous economists who said, well, when you save, right, that money gets invested into other sorts of projects, long-term projects, and can be useful in the economy. For Keynes, savings was simply loss. It was just pulling money out of the economy and was not doing anything productive. And he was arguing this is a controversial view because most economists said, well, when you save money, it gets invested. And for Keynes, this is an important point which relates to the animal spirits we talked about, the way investing works. It's not so important anymore that savings and investment are closely connected. In fact, he argues that they're not necessarily connected, that there's psychological forces at work in how much people want to invest, and there's psychological forces at work in how much they want to save. And there's no reason that people's savings and the level of investment can be or should be coordinated. Hayek criticized him for this, saying, asking whether he thought about what interest rates are for. But for Keynes, again, the savings is simply lost, and this paradox of thrift makes things worse over time. So, talking about the interest rate, Keynes, contrary to Hayek's quip, did think about interest rates some. And he had a novel kind of take on interest rates. So, traditionally, interest rates were supposed to, or economists thought about interest rates as a price, a reward for saving or the cost of borrowing. And it's a price, just like the price of oranges, that coordinates how much people save and how much people borrow. And it sends those signals, coordinates those things. Keynes gives a different perspective. He says that the interest rate is not so much about savings and sort of long-term projects and consumption, but instead, the interest rate is about liquidity. It's the cost of holding money versus not holding money. And so what's happening is the interest rate is paying people not for deferring consumption, but for giving up liquidity, giving up access to cash. And so we have models today talking about liquidity preference and how much people want to hold money, how much money they want to hold, and how that affects the overall savings in the economy and so forth. So Keynes is giving a slightly different view here. And then, most importantly, and we didn't really touch on this in class, is that going along with Keynes's focus on aggregate spending is this idea, which had been debated throughout the 18th century, about whether you can have something called a general glut or a problem of underconsumption. And so Malthus, who we've talked about in this course, along with Sismondi and others, argued that part of the reason you get recessions or even depressions is that there's an overproduction of goods. There's an overproduction of various kinds of things, a general glut. And in that overproduction, you have too many goods and not enough money. You don't have enough demand. You don't have enough functional demand. And so Keynes is arguing about this underconsumption, that it's possible that there's just not enough money to be spent, there's not enough demand to keep the economy going. And it's about dollars being spent that really incentivize people to make things, to innovate, and so forth. And so he's following on Malthus and Sismondi and others, saying they got it right, and their opponents, who you guys are familiar with, David Ricardo being one, Jean-Baptiste Say, who we didn't talk about, is another one, argued that this is the wrong way to look at things. The general glut is not the problem. It's other kinds of problems in the economy. And so there's something called Say's law, named after Jean-Baptiste Say, which says that supply creates its own demand. And what he meant by that is a very kind of Smithian point, which is that the way we become wealthier over time is by producing more goods, right? Countries are not poor because they don't have enough demand. They're not poor because they don't want stuff. They're not poor because they don't have enough paper currency or electronic currency. They're poor because they don't produce a lot of goods. And we talked about Smith, different reasons why that might be. And so what Jean-Baptiste Say argues is that economies, are built on production, productivity, specialization, and supply. And as you produce more goods, it increases your capacity to trade. So one of the examples that we could think about that Larry White brings up in the book is, imagine that you're a shoemaker. All right, you're a shoemaker and you discover a new way to produce shoes more quickly, or maybe you hire someone to help you produce more shoes. As you produce those more shoes, are you contributing to a general glut where are you worried about there not being enough demand to buy your shoes? Or are you actually increasing the amount of shoes you have to sell, which actually increases your capacity as the shoemaker to buy everything else in the economy? You have more shoes to trade or to sell and to trade with other people in the economy. And so it's actually focusing on production as opposed to consumption. And again, Keynes addresses this very specifically in his general theory, saying it's not about supply, it's about demand. And there's one nuance here, again, that we're not going to be able to get into fully in this format, but there's one nuance that Larry White brings to the conversation. He says, Say's law seems right, except you have to count money as a good, because it's possible for there to be monetary disequilibriums. We've talked about the price-specie flow in the past. If you include money as just another commodity, as another thing that flows between countries, then you're going to have this general equilibrium over time. But if you mess with the money, as Milton Friedman talks about, as other people talk about, kind of what happened in the 1920s when central bankers broke the price-specie flow mechanism, if you don't allow gold and silver and money and finance to flow freely between countries and to adjust to trade imbalances in real goods, right? Like the current account balance, where you're trading real goods and services. If there's an imbalance that let's say the U.S. is exporting a lot more goods and services than it's importing, you have to have an adjustment in the value of currencies. And so Say's law, the production of goods, the production sort of creating its own demand over time, supply creating its own demand over time, also has to allow or incorporate or include the fluctuation in the value of money and currencies between countries to offset that. You can trade goods for goods or money for goods, and the value of money has to be able to be allowed to fluctuate freely as the price of goods is allowed to fluctuate freely. All right, so that is a brief summary of the chapter. Again, Keynes, this is in contrast to Keynes, this supply side thinking, but Keynes is very direct in criticizing it. And some of the reasons he's going to give, and we're going to address this in later classes, about why the market doesn't work as well in correcting these problems, is because of money illusion, which we talked about, and also this idea of sticky prices and wages, that the price mechanism that is so central to Adam Smith's story of how the market works, to Jean-Baptiste Say's story, to later Friedrich Hayek's story. Keynes and followers of Keynes are going to argue that prices are slow to adjust, they're imperfect, and they're not going to bring about coordination, and they're not going to lead to fixing of economic problems as quickly as we would like to have them fixed, or as quickly as we could fix them if we had the right government policies.